second. Let's start with a quick word of prayer this morning. God, we just thank you for all the blessings that you give us and that you take the time to really spend time with each of us in our lives and see through all our troubles and our struggles and just give us the support that we need to make it through difficult times and to give us the blessings of great times. So we're going to start today with praise and worship to you. Amen.
Good morning. So I'm here to give you announcements. If you wondering whether there are more chairs in the room, we're now at phase 2. It's official. So masks are optional, so I think I probably look a little better with the mask. So, but especially for safety. So that's the handshakes are optional, not necessarily encouraged or discouraged now. So, but we do have a little bit of social distance. So that's kind of basically phase 2 in a nutshell. If you have questions, there's a little poster in the back under the sign that says Wi-Fi that explains what we're trying to do to be reasonable in taking precautions but still be able to worship together. If you're a visitor, we have 2 ways to let us know. We have the low-tech way, which is the green cards. You can fill these out, put them in the back where the offering box is, that back black mailbox in the back of the wall. Or the high-tech way is a little scan code on the bulletin. So high-tech, low-tech. So if you're a visitor to the bridge, and also it's a place to add any prayer requests you might have. Couple things that are going on. We have an online marriage and parenting course that's available with Paul Tripp. I don't want to say Paul W. Tripp. Is it W? W. I thought it was David. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. Well, let's not debate that now. It's not a theological question. So anyway, so it's great stuff. So if you want the link to that, so we paid for it for about, I think I want to say through early next year. If you want the link to that, let one of us elders know, and we'll figure it out somehow. So, but it's very much worth your time. If you're a high-risk person for COVID, or if you just need somebody, some help with stuff related to COVID, there is a local group of volunteers called the COVID Helpers, and we can put you in touch with those folks. Let us know. And then just want to mention the Berlin partnership. So we have plans to send a small group of folks to Berlin over Thanksgiving timeframe to work with the Picanados, probably the Yoders if they're there, and the Wiggins, and some other missionaries from the C&MA that are in Berlin during Thanksgiving time, because that's a time of, it's kind of a witness, it's an opportunity, an outreach opportunity, just to help out with that. Heidi's going to talk a little bit more about that in the missions moment, but just to draw your attention to it. And then the first Sunday in July, whatever date that is. So we're going to go back to our first Sunday kind of thing where we do something special. So with people stay late, we have a lunch after the service. So just kind of put that on your calendar. So the first Sunday in July, and I don't have a calendar in front of me to tell you actually what the date is. And then also we have circulating a couple of graduation books for Sherry and Andrea. Oh, yeah, that's what. So they're being passed. So if you want to sign it, so if you remember, Sherry's from South Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo. That's her background. And I'm sorry, Andrea. And then Sherry's from China, and she was, but they're not here because of COVID. But we're going to get them the books somehow. So if you'd take a moment, look for those books, and give them some good wishes. And also, I should mention that this is last Sunday for the Yoders that are actually going to be here. So make sure you have a chance to speak to them. And sorry, the real last Sunday. So throughout the week, just please remember to pray for them, because they're going to be. The plan is to drive away off to Arizona tomorrow, as you get ready to transition to Berlin. So please talk to them a little bit today. So anyway, so any other announcements that I missed? Okay.
Thanks for everyone's help and stuff yesterday and fixing our deck and painting. I know it was a lot of hard work for all that. There was a bucket left over from somebody that brought some stuff for cleaning. If that was yours, like a hand bucket, about maybe 3 gallons or something like that. It's in the fireside room. There's also, we had left over still 1 bag of potatoes and just a blue plastic kind of container. If you can use that, it's on the table right out here by the front door. Take it with you on your way out the door. Please make good use of it so it doesn't have to get tossed.
And you could you put the potatoes in the blue plastic container if you want to? Yeah. So, all right.
For anybody who might want to see the Paul David Tripp videos, could you point out who the elders are that they can speak to?
Okay, so I'm one of the elders. Alan's on the leadership team. Laura Lee, and where's John? The guy who's John, and
Matt.
Oh, Matt. Okay, there.
And Tammy.
Where's Tammy? No, there's Tammy. Okay, so you can talk to one of us, and we'll figure it out somehow, even if we don't know right now. But all right, thanks.
There she goes. Sorry. As you can tell, I'm technically challenged. We thought this morning for missions, we'd just read a letter that the Picanatos sent out. It's 2 weeks ago now, but I thought it was really interesting that they, as our missionaries that we're praying for, to reach out to the people that they're with, they are challenging us. And so I just wanted to read their May 27th letter. Hi, praying family. I have a pretty heavy heart this morning as I email you. The news about George Floyd was on Facebook feed and appearing on national news that I follow from Berlin. The Cooper story out of New York was on BBC.com. All of this on top of the stress, the anger, the confusion, blaming, and division about a wide variety of topics, both COVID and politically related. Please know that I am and we are praying for you. They're praying for us. You know, we don't think about that with our missionaries. Finding the sweet spot in knowing how to represent Christ well, to love God and love your neighbors, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with the Lord your God is going to be a growing challenge. My prayer for you is that the kingdom of God will be advanced through your actions in the coming days. You have such amazing opportunities to represent Christ well in what you say, who you embrace, with proper social distancing, of course, what you post, how you build others up, how you search the scriptures, and how you pray. The world is in pain around you and needs to see the peace that only the Prince of Peace can offer, and to see the reconciliation only Christ can bring. And we are ministers of that reconciliation, 2 Corinthians 5. It might sound strange to say it this way, but we are counting on you to minister there, since we cannot be there to reach out ourselves. You have sent us here as an extension of you to represent Christ well here, and we are counting on you to be extensions of us as ministers there. From our personal lives, we are praising God that Johanna finished her last test this week. Now the waiting for grades begins. As we find out how the rules are going to be relaxed in Berlin, and part of that we'll be learning what rules will not be relaxed. Pray for us as we process with our ministry and for our team. And can you also please pray for the travel restrictions to ease by mid-July? We have new teammates, whom we know, that we would really like to be able to come and get settled before the school year starts. Blessings, Mike. And I appreciated that challenge that, yes, they're missionaries going, but we are missionaries staying. And just that challenge to take every opportunity, be looking for those opportunities to say a kind word or to ask questions to get people to think about who they are and where, that they are in need of a Savior. So we can be in prayer for them. And then Heidi's going to give us an update on what's happening with looking for the team to go to Germany.
All right, so I'm kind of heading up the team that will be hopefully going to Berlin in over Thanksgiving to help kind of prepare and serve a Thanksgiving meal. That'll free up the Picanatos, the Wiggins, and hopefully the Yoders by then to be more relational and intentional in that aspect, so they don't have to get tied up with all the work part of that. So far there are 4 of us going, Jojo, Andy, and Chrissy Clark, and myself. If you are interested, please come talk to me. We'd love to get you signed up, and we're praying for at least another man to go as well. But if God's laying that on your heart, male or female, we'd love to have you. So we will be having a short meeting after church today. You can certainly jump in on that if you're considering going or want to learn more. It'll just be over in the fireside room. We will probably be doing some fundraising events in the future, as we'll have to be paying for tickets and expenses while there. So if that's also a way you can contribute, if you can pray about that, if God's laying that on your heart. I think that's the main points I had to cover. We'll probably be going for about 10 days is the estimate. We don't have dates nailed down yet, but we'll also be doing some prayer walks during that time. And I think it's a neat time to connect with the ministry there and bring that vision home. So just as we're partnering with them, they're partnering with us. And yeah, I think that was a really neat message that they sent in that letter as well. So yeah, be praying about whether that's something that God would have you do. Thanks.
Everyone needs compassion, love that's never failing. Let mercy for me. Everyone needs forgiveness, kindness of a Savior. Love of nations. Savior, He can move the mountain. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Take me as you find me, all my fears failure. Fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. Can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever,
In a moment, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Rob Carlson. Some of you may know Rob. Thanks for those songs. Wow, isn't it awesome to be here and to be singing praise to our God, how great our God is. We're really glad the Yoders are here. We had a farewell service a couple weeks ago. It kind of reminds me of when I was a little kid. I don't know if this is just Scandinavians, but people would come over for an evening, and about 9 o'clock or so, Marge would say, "Well, we should think about going." And the host would say, "Well, no, my mom would say, well, let's have just a little cup of coffee or a piece of cake." And then about another 20 minutes, "Well, we should be going." And so everybody'd stand up, and then they'd move to the kitchen and talk for 15 minutes. And then they'd move to the entryway and talk. And if it was nice weather out, they'd all stand outside the car for another 20 minutes and talk, okay? And I'm really glad you're here. Originally, their plans were they were going to start language studies on the 1st of June in Toronto, Canada. So when we made our plans, that was kind of the timeline we had. But it's kind of nice to have those long goodbyes too, aren't they? The other thing I'd like to do, as a member of the leadership team, we'd like to thank you as a congregation for your continued giving. A lot of organizations were really worried when the COVID hit and we weren't able to meet together. There's just a real fear that if people aren't meeting together, that people will kind of forget about giving to the church. And we're very thankful that you have continued to be faithful in that, even when we couldn't meet face to face. Our speaker today, and actually for the next couple of Sundays, is Rob Carlson. Rob has lived in Watertown now for 3 years. He serves a church in Watertown in Huron in the Seventh-day Adventist group. Rob's a native of Washington State, and then he did his seminary training in Michigan, so now he's a little bit in between in Watertown. So it's really fun to have somebody that brings kind of a different geographic and cultural perspective. Nate and Rob became acquainted, I think, playing basketball, didn't you? And racquetball. And that's how I got to know Rob, is through playing racquetball together. So anybody who plays racquetball, I think, is a good guy. So Rob, would you come? And we're excited to have you here today and to share the word and the next couple Sundays also. Thanks.
That was a very kind way to put it, to make sure that I'm working here. Am I? You can hear me? Okay. That we met playing basketball. That's a kind way to put it. Considering the one time we played basketball, you went away with a knee that didn't work anymore. So, yeah.
I was winning that game.
Yeah.
First two you wouldn't in that game, I was winning.
Just like maybe some of our theological discussions, we'll just agree to disagree on that and we'll be friends. So, yeah. It was good times. I'm actually really sad that we didn't get to continue doing that more than we did. The long goodbye that you mentioned, where I come from, that's called the nap goodbye. K-N-A-P-P. It's a family that we know called the Naps. That if you're trying to leave their driveway in the car, and they will be leaning in to the car, talking to you, like walking sideways while you're trying to get out. So that's what we refer to that as. Thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. I'm planning on being here the next 3 Sundays, well, this Sunday and the next 2 after that, and asking your former pastor here just for some ideas, and his wife, what I might be able to speak about, what would help. And they just mentioned that they have gone through books of the Bible at different times, and just kind of on a whim, I thought, well, have you been through Esther lately? So that, they said they hadn't, and I hope that that's true. And that's what I'm planning on doing for the next 3 Sundays that I'm with you, is talking about the book of Esther. Today, in particular, I want to be trying to get kind of a bird's eye view and talk about it a bit more from the big picture, a bit more from the distance, and then the next 2 kind of focusing in on certain parts of the story and getting in there. Hey, Josh, I haven't seen you in a while, man. I didn't recognize you with the mask on, so yeah. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I had The last place that I pastored, I had a year teaching. The last place that I pastored was up in Minot, North Dakota. And I had a second church in Bottineau, North Dakota, which is right on the Canadian border. When I announced to them that I was leaving to go teach at it was an Adventist high school, boarding high school in Colorado. And I announced to them that I was leaving. I remember afterwards, there was I remember Jason came to me afterwards and he said, Pastor, my wife and I, when you mentioned that, we looked at each other and we said, yes, we're so grateful because you are a teacher. You are not a pastor. And thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. He's right. I am not a pastor. I have been pastoring, and God has just kind of had me put in there, but I definitely am more of a teaching pastor than a whatever other things I'm supposed to be pastor. I've always been interested in teaching. I actually, before switching my college major to theology, because I wanted to study Greek and Hebrew, and that's what I was interested in, I was a history major, a senior in college as a history major, secondary education with an English minor. So I have an interest there, but I am not a historian. I conveniently dropped out right before I had to write that big 50-page paper. So I am not a historian, but I love history. And I have, see if where I'm gonna get this to click here. I do a lot of driving in the district that I live in. Because being in Watertown that I have Huron, I'm back and forth, that's 90 miles almost, and so driving back and forth, I get to listen to a lot of audiobooks and podcasts. And this here, I just put this on the screen, is a podcast that I've been listening to for years now called Hardcore History. I'm not putting this as a plug out there. I haven't been sponsored by Dan Carlin to do this, but I've been enjoying it for the take that he has. He's not a historian either. He just is a student of history who enjoys it and gets into it. And I like the way that he tells a story. One of the more recent ones that I've gone through is a story called King of Kings, where he talks about the Persian Empire. And setting up the Persian Empire and talking about it, the way he begins to get into it is talking about it kind of from the perspective that most Western people have historically looking back at the Persian Empire, and that is that they're kind of the bad guys. At least in the stories that we tell, they're more seen as Darth Vader and the Empire than they are the rebellion. Like they're seen as the big, probably the most famous story that involves the Persians. And I'm gonna get another screen up here. This is a part of the Persian Empire. It extended all the way back into India, and some historians think possibly even to the steppe lands where the Mongols and people like that were. But then all the way out here down into Egypt and south into Ethiopia was the border of it. And then up here in if you can see there, the upper left-hand corner there, you kind of see how far they get. The most famous historical event that we have recorded from the Greek historian Herodotus is a battle that took place as they were trying to get into the kingdom of Greece at a place called Thermopylae. Is that familiar to anybody? You've heard of this. It is a place where, as the narrative goes and as the story goes, there was this really narrow gap through the mountains that they had to get through. And King Xerxes, with his hundreds of thousands, if not million, army, bottlenecked trying to get in there and was held off by 300 of these plucky Spartans who stood up and fought against the evil empire that was trying to get in and invade Western Europe. And so here is this event, and this is the picture that we have of the Persians, more or less from history. The biggest one that sticks out in people's minds is that they are the big bully trying to get in, and then the underdog, right? The Spartans are seen kind of as the David in that story. The underdog holds them off. But what he does in the podcast, getting into it, is talk about how that picture gives us a really skewed vision of the Persians and really makes us see them as this big bully. But historically speaking, for this time, for the period that we're around, and all the different nations and kingdoms, the empires that had come before them, particularly in this area of the world where the Holy Lands are situated there, we have more recently Babylon, and before that Assyria, and both of those kingdoms were a lot more brutal in how they handled people and the way that they went about their business than the Persians were. The Assyrians in particular, and when you think Assyria, we think, I think Nineveh is probably the best way to think about that, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit here. This is the first thing that I have. I was asked to put these notes together so that for those of you who like to write, you can fill in the blanks and and feel really good there. This is the first thing here. We are all living in a bigger story. When we get into the book of Esther, I want to talk about it from some different angles and different points of view. But the thing that stood out to me as I started studying and getting into this is how this one small story takes place in a bigger story. We are living in a bigger story, things that are going on around us. And I think if I edge on preaching on that, I don't think it's too hard to make connections to recognizing that there are things going on in our lives, in our country, in our world, that we feel like there is a bigger story going on. Lots of things that have played into this, history that has played into it, different dynamics that have played and connected to this. So we're living in a bigger story. There's another particular angle, though, that I want to look at here besides just the historical angle of this, and that is Old Testament history in a nutshell. This is, my wife even, she saw me making this slide. She was like, don't do this. Because I really like to, it's hard for me to just be like, this is the story. I want to be like, well, it started on day one of creation. Let's turn that, that's how I want to approach it. I'm going to jump past a good deal of Old Testament history, though, and just get to here. Mount Sinai, when God met with the children of Israel, that was the best way that I have heard this put, that helped me understand what's going on here, is that Mount Sinai was a marriage ceremony. That God was sitting down, entering into a covenant, a relational agreement, like a marriage, with the children of Israel as a nation, saying, I will be yours, you be mine, and here's how everything looks. And so he made this covenant with them that included blessings and curses. And the blessings were like, hey, you stay with me, we faithful to one another, and you don't go wandering after all of those pagan gods and start sacrificing your children to those idols and all those terrible things. And I'm going to bless you. Your other nations are going to be going between Egypt and Babylon and all these places traveling, and they're going to look at what you have going on, and they're going to think, wow, I want to know that God. That God sounds great compared to what I'm seeing happening down here in Egypt or whatever it is. And so that was what God said. I'm going to bless you. It's going to be an amazing life for you if you'll stay close to me. But it also comes with these curses. There are covenant curses that are brought up here back in that story, that are brought up again by the prophets, that are brought up again in the book of Revelation. And there are these ideas that there are these 4 curses that come with not staying close to the covenant. The curses being wild beasts, famine, war, and pestilence. Or the 4 horsemen in Revelation, as they're described. And these curses are almost, I don't know, when I read them and have come across them, it's hard for me not to be like, God, why'd you have to do that? I didn't do this at my wedding. You can ask my wife. I did not tell her, if you're unfaithful to me, then war, pestilence, famine, and I didn't do that. And it seems like, God, why did you say that? But I think the more that I chew on it, the more that I look at it, and the more that I understand the character of God as revealed in Jesus, which is where we see God most clearly, I think that God, what he is doing here is describing to them cause and effect, natural consequences. Look, God says, I want to be your protector. I want to be your husband. But if you keep kicking me out of camp, if you keep booting me out of the house and locking the door, eventually somebody with bad intentions is going to come, and I'm not going to be there to protect you. And when that happens, guess what? There's pestilence. Guess what? There's famine. Guess what? There's sword. Guess what? Right? And I think God is giving them this warning, and this is the setup to this. And so Old Testament history goes through this, and what we find is we get to the latter part of the Old Testament history, and finally the northern kingdom in Israel is overcome by the Assyrians. And I put here again, Nineveh is a way to think of the Assyrians, right? These were bad people. They treated people bad, and they really do have bad PR in the Bible, the kingdom of Assyria, because of how bad they treated people and how the prophets had to cry out against them for their terrible treatment of people. I mean, it was way worse than VeggieTales and the fish slapping for the they were terrible people. The kingdom, and again, I'm pulling some of this from this podcast that I was listening to, but the kingdom of Assyria, when they would come in and take over your city, your local government, your local little king and whatnot, they would take every family member of the king and kill them in front of the king, making the king watch. And then they would pluck the eyes of the king out, so the last thing he saw was his family getting killed. And dude, I'm in church. I should not get too historically graphic. But the kingdom of Assyria was terrible in how they treated people and the way that they went about it. If in the ancient way of thinking, what would happen is their kingdom would fight against your kingdom. Okay, you would have Henry or Clark, all right? The king of Henry would come over to Watertown and he would wage war and defeat Watertown. And then what he would do is he would go through and find every little statue that represented the god of Watertown and break them into pieces and take the people and scatter them everywhere else, and half the people go live in different towns, and they'd bring people from other towns and they'd mix everyone up. And then they would lead this long parade with all the broken images of the gods and whatnot, giving the message to all the rest of South Dakota, we have defeated the god of Watertown, the god of Watertown is done, our God is the best. And that's how it typically went. That's how Babylon did it too. When we get to Babylon, as the next kingdom that comes along, that's how Nebuchadnezzar, and his father took the city of Babylon and took the young captives and, trained them with all the things and took them away. Giving the message in the ancient world, we've beaten your God, he's not as good. And that is how things went. This is what went down for the people of God, is that they were first in the north beaten by Assyria, and then in the south by Babylon. And they are put into this period of exile for 70 years that was prophesied that they would go through, at which at the end point, somebody comes along, a person referred to as Cyrus the Mede, who is the leader of the Medo-Persians together. And Cyrus the Mede, unlike the Darth Vader figure that we tend to see in history from just focusing in on that Battle of Thermopylae, Cyrus the Mede in the Bible, if anyone gets good PR, it's Cyrus the Mede. He is the first person in the Bible that is given almost a messianic level of respect, like that he is going to be the deliverer of God's people. And he foreshadows Christ in a lot of ways, and is used as a foreshadowing of Christ. But he comes in as the Savior and deliverer. And then what he does, and what the way that they did things, the reason why they are thought of or seen as a much nicer nation than the ones that came before them, is because unlike all the other ones that would come in and beat up your gods and do all these terrible things, what they would do is as soon as it was the point in the battle where, hey, you surrender, you accept our rule, okay, fine. Your leaders, why don't you lead this area? You know these people best. Why don't you all stay here? You know what? We don't want to knock down your temples and destroy your idols. We want to uplift them. We want you to go pray for them. Because their idea was, why would we do this and anger all these other gods? Maybe some of these gods could be helping us. Go pray for your God to bless the Medes and the Persians. That's what they thought. Which matches up then with the biblical account that you get into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the people of God are told, go back, rebuild Jerusalem. And this is what Cyrus the Mede tells them to go do. Go back and rebuild your temple so that you can pray to your God, so that he can bless our kingdom. And so the end of the 70-year period happens, and the people are sent back. However, and this is recorded in Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, that decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. However, there are many, if not the majority, of Jewish exiles who do not return from their exile to go back to Jerusalem. Is this cutting in and out? Are we okay? 'Cause I can grab the handheld if I need to. Well, let me know if I need to. Okay. There are many who stay. I've tried to do this as succinctly as I could, but we have caught up to the context of the book of Esther. Because the book of Esther now enters us into the story of a Jewish man named Mordecai and his niece Hadassah, her Jewish name, who are living as exiles after the exile is over. They have been living now probably where they are in Susa for at least 100 years, maybe 150 years, maybe 200. They have been there long enough. Excuse me, sorry to interrupt. Could I get a cup of water? I have a little itch in my throat. Excuse me. They've been living there long enough for that to become home. That's long enough, right? Wouldn't you think? I'm from the Pacific Northwest, from Spokane, Washington. It's where I was born, where I was raised. And I still think of that as home in a lot of respect. I've been in the Midwest now for 10 years, and 10 years is enough for me to start thinking about the Midwest as home. Well, imagine how my great-great-grandkids would feel, right? this would be home to them by that amount of time. The time goes by, and that's what it is. And that was home for them. And so a lot of people, they stayed. The diaspora is the word that I put there. That is the historical word that is used to refer to the scattering of the Jews into all these different nations when they were taken and put different places. And it was something that they never, I don't know if recovered is the right word, but they never did all of the Jews come back. That spreading out into everywhere is something that stayed until today. That they went into all these different places and kind of have pockets of the Jewish nation that are just placed in lots of different places. This is where we are. This is where we are in Esther. So now in Esther, we already saw that we are living in a bigger story. But Esther is now going to show us that we are living a smaller story. We are living a smaller story. Now there's a bigger story going on around us. And I can't remember if I put that as the next slide. I didn't. We'll get to the next slide here. The next thing to fill in there. But we are living in a bigger story, but we are living a smaller story. Now here, my next run through, I've hit history, I've hit Old Testament perspective. Now let's take a crash course on the story of Esther. Just as a reminder, if you haven't been through this or the first time, that's all right. Then you get to know what this book is all about. Here is my highlighted bullet point view of the book of Esther. First, in chapter 1, the king who is, and this is, I have to take a second here because this is why I started where I started by talking about the Persian Empire. Ahasuerus is how he is referred to as the king who ruled from India to Ethiopia, as the book of Esther starts off. And I looked in commentaries and things like that while I'm reading, because while I understand a little bit of Hebrew and Greek, I am not a master in them by any means. I'm barely intermediate in my understanding. But looking at this, I learned that Ahasuerus is the Latin/Hebrew way of pronouncing the Greek name Xerxes. That Xerxes, the king, the same king, historically, putting it together, and the book of Esther gives us the time frames of his reign and things that happened. Now, chapter 1 starts off with the king throwing a feast, and he invites all of the leaders all together. Historically, this drops down someplace that this almost gives me goosebumps, because I just love putting these connections and stuff together. This is probably, most likely, a gathering together of generals to plan an invasion into Greece, happening in chapter 1. And while they're there drinking and making their plans, which is how, as they would do this and come up with their ideas and make their strategies, then get ready to march off with the army. It is during this feast that the king has this moment where he asks his queen, Vashti, to come to show off how beautiful she is, and she refuses to come. And the king is really upset by this, but not as upset as the young men in the kingdom who, upon hearing this, come up with an idea. Hey, king, you've got to make a law that your wife obeys you, because if the queen doesn't obey you, my wife won't obey me. You can see where this is going, king. It's not good. So they put this idea, and they make a law that the wives should obey their husbands. And then chapter 1 ends. There we go. We're going to come to Mordecai and Hadassah, but chapter 1 ends, and then there is a gap period between that and the events of chapter 2 and chapter 3 as we go on. And apparently, this is the time when Xerxes led his army to the gates of Thermopylae, tried and failed, and came back after an expensive, terrible campaign that was the biggest loss in the Medo-Persian Empire. Like a time when, up until this point, they were seen as favorable people that God's hand obviously was on as they were setting people free. They're on a train of going through these different nations, and just like with the Jews in Babylon, they come along and the people, as for the most part, loved this Persian Empire coming in and restoring things back to the way that they should be. Giving them back their rights and their religion and the freedoms that they had to be able to be the people that they were. Not just the Jews, other nations, they felt this way. And so here this kingdom goes, and for the first time, it gets its tail handed to it and turns around, and the king Xerxes has to come back now. Why is this important to me? Because this colors the whole story for the rest of it for me to understand. When you're Esther now, and you're about to, sorry for the spoiler, we're going to jump ahead here. You're about to approach the king and go in there. it just adds a level of tension and intensity to this story, knowing the history that has gone on around this, the frame of mind that the king must be in these times. And who we're dealing with here. Xerxes. This is not just some random schlub king. This is Xerxes. And so, okay. Chapter 2, Mordecai and Hadassah. We meet this Jewish man named Mordecai who has apparently a very beautiful, both inwardly and outwardly, niece that he is taking care of named Hadassah. And she is conscripted into this plan to bring together, to appease the king and get him over the loss of Vashti, to bring together all these beautiful women so that the king can choose the one that he likes the most to become the new queen in place of Vashti. And so, chapter 2 continues to go on and tell us Hadassah, which Esther then, because kind of taking a less Jewish sounding name, Esther is chosen, chapter 2. Chapter 2 ends with Mordecai, her uncle, discovering a plot that was put together to do some harm to the king. And he discovers this, foils the plot, and then it's kind of like, wow, Mordecai did this amazing thing. We ought to do something to honor Mordecai someday, but it never happens. And so that's just kind of tucked in there at the end of the story. We go on now here. Chapter 3 tells us, it introduces us to the person who the story wants us to see as the antagonist, the bad guy, the real enemy here, a person named Haman, who develops a grudge against Mordecai. Haman, who apparently, again, looking at some of these commentaries and stuff, there is a historical record of a person of this name. And the thing that's interesting about him is that he was not a born leader. He was not somebody with the silver spoon in his mouth, like a lot of the people in these times were. He was somebody who was a nobody who rose up into power, which kind of, I don't know, it adds a little more color to this story for me. To see here that this guy he's risen up, and he's almost become addicted to now people looking at him in a different way. And when one person all of a sudden does not look at him in this way, Mordecai, he really does not like it. And I'm going to talk more about this when I talk in the sermons I have coming up in a couple weeks. But I'd always just assumed that Mordecai did not bow to Haman because of his Jewish beliefs of not bowing to somebody. And then I discovered that Abraham bowed down to Gentile kings when they came to him in reverence, just not as a worship, not as a you are God or something like that, but just a reverential Middle Eastern bow that Abraham gave to him. That apparently there was at least precedent for that to not be something that was necessarily you can't do, which suggests that Mordecai may have actually just had a personal grudge against Haman to not want to bow down to him. That it may have been more than just, I'm just a great Jew. In fact, as we read the story, if you really focus in and read the story, it doesn't seem that Mordecai or Esther are what we would classify as great Jews. That they weren't people, in fact, I find this fascinating. The most recent biblical hero to Esther, the most recent, if she's going to look back at someone who's seen as this biblical hero, but it's been close in history to her, I would say probably you'd come down to Daniel and his three friends, right? And in those stories, Daniel and his three friends, you find them in chapter 1 of Daniel standing, we will not eat the king's food, we will not drink the king's wine, and you will test us, and we will prove that the Jewish way of doing things is better than your way of doing things, right? We will not bow down. We can't. They proudly stand for their Jewish heritage. They're wearing it on their sleeves. You come to Esther and Mordecai in chapter 2, the first thing he tells her is, just don't let anyone know you're Jewish. Just keep that to yourself. That's fine. They don't seem to be, if you really look at what you're expected to be as a Jew, the most stringent, strict Jewish followers. Anyway, but they are definitely Jewish and associate themselves that way. Going on here, I can't dwell too long here. Esther, chapter 4, agrees to help under some duress. And again, we'll talk about this more when we next week. I'll be talking about chapter 4 in particular more. But Esther has this most inspiring line that she gives, and that Mordecai gives her this very inspiring line of maybe perhaps you were born for such a time as this, right? If there's a verse that you're taking out of Esther, that's the one. If there's one that you're going to put on a poster and put it on the wall with some nice scenery on it or something, right? That's the one. Perhaps you were born for such a time as this. But that's chapter 4, verse 14, and that's the second half of the verse. The part of the verse before that, the first half of 14, Mordecai tells her, you know what? You may choose not to help, and the nation will get saved through some other means, but you and your family are going to go down. Oh, and by the way, you could have been born for such a time as this. and so she agrees to help, and there is this reality, this fear, almost this threat to her personally of weighing this out, of approaching the king and going to help. And then she finally does at the end of chapter 4. She agrees to go help, and if I die, I die. She gives that line. The rest of the context of the book. She prepares a banquet. This is her plan. She puts together a banquet, asks the king, goes and approaches him and says, and the king holds out the scepter and says, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom you can have. Brilliant. What do you think I would do, or what would you do in that scenario? You've just approached the king in boldness, and he says, I'll give you half the kingdom. What do you do? Considering the story, considering what's going on, you say, save my people, right? You lay out the plan that Haman has put out and everything, and you ask for the deliverance of your people. No, she says, can I have a banquet? We'll invite you and Haman to come to the banquet. Haman, then in chapter 5, plans to hang Mordecai. He's all upset at Mordecai, and he makes these gallows. He's thinking, boy, I've just risen up and up and up, and everyone respects me except this guy. And his friends all encourage him, you should just make this big 50-foot gallows so that we can hang him and everyone will see it and it'll be all embarrassing for his family. Okay. Chapter 6, my favorite chapter in the book. I love this chapter. The king has a restless night. He can't sleep. And he gets this idea, why don't we just have someone read to me? And apparently they did not have good novels or things to read back in those days. So he asks for just the court records to come and someone to just read him the boring. And those were boring. The Greeks were the ones who really introduced, at least beyond the Hebrews, who introduced better storytelling. These guys, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Medes, their storytelling was quite dry. and so the king is listening to these things, and he hears the record, and he remembers Mordecai. And hears about the story about Mordecai back in chapter 2, how Mordecai had foiled this plan. So the king is sitting there, and he's going, what, did we ever do anything for that guy? Remember, we were going to honor him in some way. Whatever happened? Well, no, we have no record of it, king. And he hears something outside of his window. So, hey, who's out the window? The servant goes and looks out the window. It's Haman. Haman is down there. Well, bring Haman up here. So Haman comes up, and the king tells him, Haman, what should we do for the person who the king delights in? And Haman, boy, old Haman, he's just got such pride, right? He thinks to himself, boy, I know exactly what we should do. Because he's thinking it's him. And he says, we should have a horse, the king's horse. And we should get the king's crown and the king's robe and put them on him and let a servant take and parade Haman, or not Haman, sorry, king, whoever it is, wink, wink, right? Parade them through the city and shout out, this is what will be done to the person the king delights in. And everyone will see that and think, wow, the king really delights in this person. This gives us a window into Haman that is just, what level of narcissism, what level of pride are you operating at when the king, the greatest king on the planet, offers you anything? I mean, he could have had a Ferrari. He could have had a swimming pool. Like what? He says, I want to be paraded around and have people say that you like me. Oh, wow. That's Haman. Okay, so the king makes Haman honor Mordecai. Everything twists because the king hears him telling him this and says, that's a great plan. I was talking about Mordecai. Go do that for him. So Haman has to go down, and I imagine my son has this ability he inherited from me to be able to get this really just upset look on his face. And I imagine Haman with this frown on his face going through the town, shouting out those words. And he has to honor Mordecai. Then Esther throws a second feast. The king at the feast asks Esther, what is it that you want? Up to half the kingdom. And again, I'm in this position, and what do? How do I answer? Haman is the bad guy. We need to kill him. This is this terrible plan, save the Jews, right? No, she asks for a second feast. it's hard for me to read that and not to think she's just stalling. Like, she doesn't have the courage yet to do what she needs to do. She already has the king. She has the favor. She has the permission. She's been given the request. What do you want? Half the kingdom. Let me just throw you another feast. Okay, well, I like feasting, apparently, so he does it. Then, during the second feast, this is when the king asks again, and Esther does it. She drops the bomb and reveals Haman's treachery. The king, it says in drunken anger in the Hebrew, hears about this and is very, very upset and has Haman immediately hanged on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. And that is where I always thought the story ended. But there are a couple more chapters, 3 more chapters in the book of Esther. First of all, Esther approaches the throne again. And I did not, this is one of those things that just slipped my awareness of the story as I chewed on it. She approaches again and has to have the golden scepter held out to her again. And it is. The king holds out the scepter. And this time she comes, what is it? What can I give you? And then Esther talks to the king and ends up saving the life of the Jews by letting the king know, hey, by the way, remember this time when Haman came with this idea and you put it into law? And we all know that the laws of the Medes and the Persians can never be changed. What are we going to do about this? Because the time is coming up. The 12 months have been ticking down. And the time is going to come when all the Jews are going to be killed. Well, they can't undo the law of the Medes and the Persians. So the king has to come up with a creative plan. So what he does is he makes another law on top of that. Very, very bureaucratic. Let's just make another law on top of that. The new law was the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. So every Jew on that day, pick up a sword. You're allowed to. It's okay. And defend yourself. And then, this is the part of the story where it just starts to slide off the rails for me as I'm going through it. The Jews end up turning their salvation into the death of 75,000 other people and end up defeating their enemies, and this is Old Testament. We're kind of used to seeing some of this kind of stuff, and I'm sure there can be some reasons and some things in there. With many of the other stories, we see what those reasons are. But it's jarring to me today to read that again and to see, wow, they were just set free. Wouldn't you like to see the Jews celebrate their freedom and extend freedom to everybody? But instead, they say, hey, we're allowed to take up the sword. Let's go get our enemies now and make sure that anybody who could possibly hurt us ever again in the future is put to the sword. And they go around stabbing 75,000 people. And then they throw a feast. Hey, every year we should remember how we were saved and then we stabbed 75,000 people, called the Feast of Purim. And then the book ends with a tiny little chapter, chapter 10, that talks about how great Mordecai became and how he became the second to the king like Haman had been. That's the smaller story, the book of Esther in a nutshell. And here is the final, the next line. And don't worry, this is not an indicator of how long it's going to take. The rest of these are going to tick off really quick. We are all living a smaller part of a big story. That was bringing all that together. Now, let's see what I got here. I brought up a couple of different people here to look at. Our view of the story, and I can't remember if I must have not made a slide on this or the slide is later. I can't remember, sorry. I'll just tell you this fourth one here. Our view of the story is limited. Our view of the story is limited. There is a bigger story going around Esther. Even the story within her local context, she doesn't have all the information on. And I brought up a couple examples here, Old Testament examples, or an Old Testament and a New Testament example. The first one that I brought up here, that was there. Sorry. Job. When we look at the story of Job, we have this story of somebody who undergoes a great deal of suffering, has these long conversations with his friends about the justification behind it, what God is actually up to. And God eventually comes and answers Job. But the thing that is jarring about that to me when I read through it is that God actually never answers Job. He just kind of puts Job in a perspective of seeing, hey, I'm God, and you really can't understand how everything is happening here. That's really what he does. But he doesn't answer Job's questions. Job goes through the suffering, ends up being cured of his suffering, ends up being given more blessings again in his life, which I think any rational parent would say that the wounds are still there, like new children isn't a replacement for children you've lost. But Job has gone through all of this, and never in the story is Job given the insight of the conversation that the devil and God were having about him behind the scenes. He never sees the big picture of what's going on. His perspective is limited. Here's another character that the same exact thing could be said about. A person whose perspective was limited. John the Baptist, the one that Jesus called the greatest born of women, the greatest prophet who has ever lived, died in prison in a place that we assume must have been discouragement based on the report, the disciples that he sent to Jesus asking, are you actually the Messiah? He ends up being beheaded. Probably, and this is a reading between the lines for me, but I think it's logical at least to assume that John the Baptist's perspective of Jesus was probably very similar to most Jews' perspective of the Messiah. They expected him to kick out the Romans and turn over the empire and be the next King David right then. And it didn't happen the way that he was expecting it to happen. And he never sees the big picture of what's going on and ends up dying that way. This is our view of this. There's the slide for it. Our view is the story of limited. Now, next thing here. The book of Esther shows us two pictures of God. The first picture is that God is absent. Read through the book of Esther. Look for the name God. Look for anything ascribed to God, any actions of God. You won't find it. In fact, scholars have argued for years, centuries, millennia, I don't know how long. Scholars have argued about whether or not this book, Esther, should actually be included in the Bible because it doesn't mention God. It talks about things happening and people being delivered, and it talks about Jewishness, but it does not mention God at all. In this story, God appears to be absent. And this is why, this is one of the places, and I believe that this story can speak to us today, because God can very much appear to be absent. We don't seem to see a lot of the same, and sometimes we do. I know that happens, and there are times when we get these insights into seeing God. But God very much, for a lot of us, can very much appear absent. And in this story, God appears absent, but God is actually moving. He's actually moving through this whole story. Like, you read it through and you start looking for God in the way that you look for the movement of the wind that you can't see, but you see the effects of it, right? You start looking for the effects and the movement of God, and it gets incredible to see how many places. And we're just going to run through all of the rest of the fill-ins, except for the very last one, are going to be on this slide right here. God behind the scenes. We can see God behind the scenes in the book of Esther in the young men's plan in chapter 2. This is just a few of them. I just went through and scanned and thought, I'm going to go through and look for places that I feel like I see God happening here, right? This is a funny one to put up here, maybe. The young men's plan, we should make this decree and get all these beautiful women and have you pick one. It's hard in the moment, maybe, to see that as having God's hand behind that. But if that did not happen, then there would have been no Esther. There would have been no Jewish young person with the ability to approach the king and confront this plot that Naaman had put down. God's hand is on that. Hegai, I spelled that wrong. It should be Hegai, not a big deal. But Hegai is the eunuch that ends up being in charge of Esther. And it mentions in the story, I love this little line in here, that Esther won his favor. Now, that seems to be, again, just he started to like her, and she won his favor. But again, go back to the most recent biblical hero of Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, it talks about the favor of somebody being won by somebody in charge of them many times. That Daniel and his friends, the person in charge of them, he wins their favor. And then Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel wins his favor, and Darius. But in the story of Daniel, it describes that action to God, that God gave him favor. Now this book doesn't mention the name of God, but we see the same action happening here. God gave Esther favor and had his hand on that process with the eunuch that was taking care of her. Mordecai's advice in chapter 2, verse 10, the moment, again, where he tells Esther, by the way, just don't let anyone know that you're Jewish, almost seems like a lack of courage on his part, and maybe in the moment it kind of was, but yet here's another place where God has his hand on this process to keep her identity in that way at least somewhat hidden. Which makes sense that she could have blended in as a local, considering that she's Jewish, which means that she came from Abraham, who grew up about 150 miles away from Susa in the land of Ur, in the city of Ur. So she looks like a local. And she was able to keep her identity as it was, which plays into the story and the ability to do what she does. Another place that we see God's at work. The king loves Esther. I put this, that I see the hand of God in this, and I see God moving in this, because God is love, and where we see love, we see the fingerprints of God. He is moving. Mordecai's discovery that he makes at the end of chapter 2. The plot that he foils ends up putting all of these things in motion and having everything there. And I see God's hand working in that. Esther's courage in chapter 4, verse 16. The courage that Esther has to be able to go forward to the king, to be able to look at that and to be able to, that kind of courage to be able to approach the King of Kings, as Xerxes was called. Because you actually have the courage given to you by the actual King of Kings, right? That kind of courage is something that comes from God, and we can see God's hand on that. And then the place, this is my number one place that I love seeing the hand of God in an invisible way, is chapter 6, with the king's insomnia, the sleepless night that he has. Here, King Xerxes, in this story, within this, he's not Nebuchadnezzar, from Daniel, a king who we get this conversation with God and this turnaround where he becomes converted, the only pagan king to write a chapter of the Bible, Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar. We don't get this perspective. Or Darius, we can see in his great love for Daniel, and he just seems to be a guy who really, he's got this harmony too that seems to be going on with God. Xerxes / Ahasuerus, however you want to say his name, he does not ever in this story seem to have a moment where, I'm on God's side. He just seems to be a pagan king who drinks a lot. That's what we get. That's the picture we get in the book of Esther. And yet this chapter has him not able to sleep on a night, randomly asked to be read from a boring book of records, hear about Mordecai again. Oh, we should do something for him. Hear a sound out the window. Send his servant. Oh, it happens to be Haman who's down there. Bring Haman up. Have Haman. This whole thing, if you can't see the hand of God on this, then it's just really, really creative storytelling where someone had to make it up. Because that has the hand of God all over it. And by the way, there is a biblical precedent for God messing with kings in their sleep. Also, back to the book of Daniel, or all the way back to the book of Genesis. There's precedent for that. And the last one here, the timing of the feasts. Again, this is one of those moments that I went through, even as I was telling you and walking through the bullet points of the story. It was the moment that I thought, this just doesn't make sense. Why would you do this if you're Esther? Why ask for the first feast when the king already told you, I'll give you up to half the kingdom? Just ask for it then. And then you get the king and Haman together, and the king says it again, I'll give you whatever you want. And she asks for a second feast. And all of that, it seems like this moment of like courage that is lost or something. She doesn't quite have the, what she needs to come forward. But if it did not happen this way, if it did not break down the way that it did, if there wasn't the periods of time, because up until that second feast happened, Haman hadn't really revealed himself. He hadn't made the gallows. He hadn't put everything into motion so that when it finally came down, the table was really set for it to happen. And there's a way, I think, that God leads on her heart, maybe even in ways that aren't clearly like we tend to think of God leading us. Maybe even that failure of nerve at the first feast that I see on her, maybe that even has God's hand on it because he knew the time wasn't quite right. Which is encouraging to me because it reminds me that God can still lead in ways that maybe I don't often give him credit for being able to lead. That he still can have his hand on this stuff. That the big picture story and all these different things and these pieces that are moving around this giant chessboard, that God has this providence and this way of leading and moving and doing things. There is this huge story that we're part of. Here's the last slide, the last piece, and I'm going to close it with this. When I speak the next time, if you guys will still have me in a week, when I speak the next time, this time I was trying to look at big picture. We're all part of the big story. Historically, big picture going on. Persian Empire against the Grecians. Big things happening. Biblically speaking, this big long narrative of covenant failure and exile and all these things happening. Personally in the story, there's all these big elements and all this big picture going on. So we are all part of, to the very top of the page, we're all living in a bigger story. Next week, what I want to talk about specifically, though, is that my smaller story matters. My smaller story matters. We can be facing things that seem so far out of our control right now, and that we can't understand what's going on or how to make heads or tails of it, or not even know what to do with the things that are happening in the nation, in the world, in our church, whatever it be, in our lives. But this is the big takeaway that I take away from Esther. As I look at all of those huge story things happening, we're going to get in the next time and find out by looking closely that my story matters. Esther's story matters. Should I close with a prayer, or is there somebody else who was planning on that? Let's close with a word of prayer. Jesus, thank you for this time together, and thank you for the ways you have inspired me through this story. I just pray that you would use your Spirit to speak to each heart here what it is that you want us to hear, to take away and hold on to what it is you want us to hold on to, and to move us where you want us to go. Thank you for being in charge of this great story that we're part of. And thank you, God, for the privilege that we have of engaging in life with it. In your name I pray, Jesus. Amen.
In my wrestling and in my doubts, in my failures, you won't walk out. Your great love will lead me through. You are peace in my trouble sea. Oh, you are peace in my trouble sea. In the silence you won't let go. In the questions your truth will hold. Your great love will lead me through. You are peace in my trouble sea. Oh, you are peace in my trouble sea. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. Oh, my lighthouse, I will trust the promise. You will carry me straight to shore, safe to shore, safe to shore, safe to shore. I won't fear what tomorrow brings. With each morning I'll rise and sing. My God's love will lead me through. You are peace in my troubled sea. Oh, you are peace in my troubled sea. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. Oh, my lighthouse, I will trust the promise. You will carry me safe to shore, safe to shore, safe to shore, safe to shore. Fire before us, you're the brightest. You will lead us through the storms. Hey, fire before us, you're the brightest. You will lead us through the storms. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. Oh, my lighthouse, I will trust the promise.